I'll be teaching a course to expand on Jews' civil rights, race, privilege, power, all of these themes later in the summer. And this particular group, as I understand it, will be able to travel to the South and tour the actual sites and places we'll be describing. And for all those reasons, I just have to give a special shout out to Professor Stephen Whitfield, Brandeis University, who is a dear friend and colleague and my wife's favorite professor from her days at Brandeis, and in fact, a scholar in several of the fields where I'll be talking about today. So it's great to have you here. And with that, I'm going to go to sharing the screen to say that this is officially, we might call this a book talk. In the academic world, this is where you sort of hear someone talk about their most recent publication. This is actually more an about the book talk than it is itself. So what I want to do is sort of give you all a behind the scenes tour of this particular book and sort of its journey over time, because I think the story of the evolution of the book itself is a narrative for us to understand a lot of the deeper historical issues at play, and also so much that's going on in contemporary America. So this was my first book. This was my doctoral dissertation, and it was a history of American Jewish liberalism. And as is often the case when you are a young academic, you get this idea for your second book from your first book, from your doctoral dissertation. And I really liked the last two chapters of this book, which are about the 1960s. And, it's such an exciting decade. And I thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if I could sort of dive deep into just the 1960s and do an entire book on that. So I got started. And all right, here's another fun fact. Usually the last thing that gets picked for a book is its title. And oftentimes, as much as the author has our own idea of what we think our title should be, our editors, who are actually the professionals at this, they come back and say, actually, that's a lousy title. Here's a better title for you. So here was my first title for what became Black Power Jewish Politics. And I called it Turning Inward because I was really interested in how the 1960s social protest movements changed into the 1970s into this sort of Jewish ethnic revival, this Jewish religious revival, this renewed interest by Jewish youth in the fact that they're Jewish. And to date myself, I grew up in the 70s, so this book was also going to be a journey of self-discovery, as it were, an academic way to get at my own life. Because those of us raised in the 70s, well, a lot of us ended up more religiously observant than our parents were. Some of us became kosher or more kosher than even our parents, and like we'd come home and like refuse to eat. There was a political revival in the 1970s that I wanted this Turning Inward book to address. Soviet Jewry movement is probably the best known. 10,000 American Jews taking to the streets in some of the biggest demonstrations, which is something we really have not seen or had not seen in American Jewish history. And something, of course, which is topical of all the national news broadcasts now, which is Zionism. After the 1967 Six-Day War, American Jews, or American Jewish youth at least, really were drawn into Zionism, and there was really unexpected enthusiasm for the state of Israel. Maybe during Q&A or maybe in another talk, we can sort of, compare what was going on in the 60s to what's going on now. But I found this fascinating, and I thought this would be a good book to write on it. And then, hold on, here we go. I changed the title, and I just use this because it's the same title called "Is It Good for the Jews?" Because as I was reading the sources from the 1970s, this question kept coming up: Is it good for the Jews? Now, I knew growing up and through a lot of American Jewish history, Jewish people always asked if a certain political candidate or a certain program was good for the Jews, but they tended to ask that question privately, maybe around the dinner table or at synagogue or something. It's not something that you really wanted to be public about because, sort of we didn't want the general public to think that we were only interested in what was good for the Jews. But by the 1970s, I noticed that this was being talked about so publicly. There were articles that were being written with that title. And here, of course, we have a book with that title. Something happened in the 1960s that seemed to give permission for Jews to take what was a private interest in politics and make it go public. Ultimately, as Robin expressed in the introduction, the title became Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. I had a fantastic editor at Brandeis University Press. She came up with this title. Initially, I thought it was really long and way too descriptive and slightly boring. And then when the incredible graphics team at Brandeis University came up with this book cover, I was like, wow, that's fantastic. I like this. And then, as I'll get to later, when the racial reckoning occurred and American Jews were interested in learning about the racial reckoning within the Jewish community, and they do the Google searches on the internet, because of this title, the book came up at the top of the Google searches and lots of people found me. So I called my editor. I said, I was so wrong. You were so right. This is exactly what a book title is supposed to do. So the thesis of the book, and now I'm going to do a little bit of historian speak, but it's important to sort of understand. The word is causality. Causality means what caused history to be what it is. And what academic historians want to do is assign causality. We want to make an argument or make a case for what we think was most important. And for me, as I did the research for this book, I discovered 3 causal agents. The first thing I found was that US history, more than Jewish history, was significant. And this is important because I happen to teach in a department of Jewish studies. And if you're in Jewish studies, kind of the idea of being in Jewish studies is the Jewish is the most important thing. The Jewish is the central factor. If you want to know what caused history to be what it is, the answer should be Jewish. And I found here that the answer was more US than Jewish, that the Jewish impulse seems secondary to the US. The second thing I argued, of course, this is a book about the 60s. So I looked at all the different social protest movements going on in the 60s, and then I put sort of what American Jews were doing in the middle of it. And I saw that American Jews were very much a part of the larger culture of the 60s. So the second causal agent was the 60s. And then obviously this was shocking to me because my first book title was Turning Inward. I wasn't thinking about Black Power, but everywhere I looked in the archives, I kept finding Black Power coming up again and again and again. So it turned out that the book's thesis actually followed that evidence. And ultimately, I argued that a major driving causal agent was the Black Power movement. This is a very famous book on Jewish memory. And that's because another, sort of contribution of this book, and something that also caused a bit of controversy around the book, is how it looked at Jewish historical memory of the civil rights movement, which is one way of saying that, at least when I grew up in the 70s, as a kid, I heard a lot of stories about Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. I certainly heard about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was essentially Dr. King's rabbi. I learned about the Selma March. I learned about Jewish founders of the NAACP, and by the way, all of this is historically accurate and true. And it turns out there were more layers to the story, more complexities to the story, more things happening that were not covered as much in the history books, and certainly in the religious school that I went to, and certainly that people of my generation did. So one thing this book did is it challenged Jewish historical memory. And with that, and this is probably the most challenging argument of the book in terms of a lot of its white Jewish readers, It challenged what's called American Jewish exceptionalism. We can define that term in a lot of different ways, but one way is to say being Jewish in America made us more special, more different. We could even say better than other white Americans. And by the way, there is an increasing number of diverse Jews and Jews of color. So right now I'm referring to those Jews who kind of look like me, you know, in terms of being white. And it turns out through this research, I learned perspectives and ideas that even in the 1960s, and actually even as far as the 1950s, there were other narratives that did not portray Jews in as flattering a way as at least I had thought about that growing up. So when the manuscript was finished, I reached out to my friend Ilana Kaufman. I don't know if folks here know Ilana. Ilana is the founder and president of the Jews of Color Initiative. She lives out here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I sort of wanted a reality check, you know, on the manuscript. So I asked her if she would give it a read, and she was gracious to give me the time to read it. And then we went to have lunch to talk about it. And boy, oh boy, did she give me critique. The first thing, you know, I don't know if it's the first thing, but she said to me at this lunch, Mark, you wrote 250 pages about Blacks and Jews, and not a single page about a Black Jew. How could you do that? Right? And so, by the way, those of us in academics have an answer to a critique. And when the critique is, I wish you wrote the book I would have written instead of the book you wrote, then we basically give that answer. And I did. And within about 3 sentences, Ilana just took down that argument, and she actually took down the thesis of the book. She said, Mark, you know, your causal agents were, you know, US history in the 60s and Black power. How much was Jewish whiteness a causal agent? She said, go back and reread each of your chapters and ask yourself how much of what happened in that chapter is because the Jewish people you're talking about are white. To flip it, she said, if a Black Jew were in those chapters, would their historical experience have been the same or different? Okay, that was a wow. And as soon as she said that, I said, okay, I gotta, you're like, I get that. And by the way, I'm now naming it the Kaufman test because I want to honor Ilana for this. When I teach and when I publish, and I want to talk about, you know, American Jews, and I'm usually talking about social justice stuff because that's my field. If what I'm about to say applies to all Jewish people, regardless of racial status, I say Jewish. If what I'm about to say really only applies to white Jews, I want to make sure I say white Jew instead of just Jewish. I have been amazed in the last, 4 or 5 years since I've learned this, how many times I've had to say white Jew instead of Jewish as it goes. So I was putting this on the Zoom book talk circuit, and one of the people on the Zoom turned out to be the wife of a man named Charles McDew, Chuck McDew. And she was excited to show me his autobiography that she held up to the screen. So SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was one of the most important civil rights organizations in the 60s. The first president of SNCC was Marion Barry, who went on to become mayor of Washington, D.C. That's how most people know him. I know we have a D.C. person here, right? The third president of SNCC was John Lewis. John Lewis, you know, the famed congressman from Georgia who wanted to good trouble and was famous. The second president of SNCC, the one in between those two, was Chuck McDew, a Black Jewish man. I had gone and written an entire book on the subject without even knowing that there was a central prominence. And as civil rights activist Bob Moses referred to Chuck McDew, he said he was Black by birth, a Jew by choice, and a revolutionary by necessity. So sitting there at lunch with Ilana, oh yeah, and this, by the way, was on the 50th anniversary of the Selma March was going on when we had that lunch. And the Union for Reform Judaism, the Reform Movement, and the NAACP had decided to have a reenactment of the Selma March 50 years later, where they had some 200 rabbis marching with the Torahs and NAACP members from Selma to DC. And then they did like a voting rights rally when they got to DC. And with Facebook, all these rabbis, white rabbis, put up a Facebook picture, which was white rabbi, Torah, black NAACP member. And I can only imagine that some of these rabbis came home to their synagogues feeling like they were like Rabbi Heschel, praying with their feet, which is in fact not what Heschel said. He said he felt as if his feet were praying. It's a slight difference, but it's huge theological difference in meaning. And Alana said to me at that lunch, where am I in this Facebook picture? Where do I go here, right? And then we talked about the phrase Black-Jewish relations. If it's a relationship between those who are Jewish and those who are Jewish and those who are Black, it's a white Jew that's inferred. Even the phrase Black-Jewish relations erases Black Jews from the conversation. And then Alana said, and I share this with her permission because she's offered me permission to share this conversation. Did these white rabbis bring in Black Jews to train them before they went on this march? What is it like to be on both sides of the Black-Jewish relationship simultaneously? Well, by the time this lunch finished, I realized, and this is we put in some of the advertisements for this talk, what it is to be a white man who's writing. And of course, I was viewing this through my own lens, growing up in the white suburbs of LA in the 1970s and looking at the turn inward, right? That's where this book was initially been. And now all of a sudden, I'm in the middle of it. So I asked Alana's permission if I could, I had not for the first edition of the book, and I said, can I make this lunch the epilogue? And she agreed. And I said, in this way, I can begin to at least acknowledge the parts of my argument that I missed. And really, it's an invitation to the next scholar who's going to write this, probably going to be a Black Jewish scholar, I can only imagine. Not to say a white person couldn't do it, they could, if they had a deep enough understanding, but clearly I realized I did not have a deep enough understanding. So here I want to advertise Charles McDoux's book, and it was Beryl Gilfix who was the one that I met on the Zoom call. It's called Tell the Story. So if you're interested, I recommend his book. This is Professor Javon Johnson. He now runs Black Studies at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, but he taught with me at SF State. Actually, he taught before me in the same classroom, and which meant for 5 to 8 minutes twice a week, we would chat, as he was cleaning up all of his stuff from his class, and I was setting up all of my stuff from my class. Towards the end of the semester, he said, Mark, my students are doing their oral presentations next week. Could you hold your students in the hall? We're probably going to run late, and I don't want to interrupt my students. And I said, of course, I'll hold them in the hall. I said, what's the oral report on? And he said, the oral report is how their race and ethnicity influence their communication style. Now, Professor Johnson is in communication studies, and the course is race, ethnicity, and communications. So that's a very logical assignment. So I said to Professor Johnson, I thought I would be impressing him, that in the Department of Jewish Studies, we would never have such an assignment, because we want students who don't identify as Jewish to be in our class. And honestly, I explained to him, the Jewish students, they come in a pack, they sit in the center of the room, they usually go to Jewish summer camp together, some went to day school together, they're dating, they're breaking up, they've got drama, there's a whole scene with the Jewish students in a Jewish studies class. And then the students who aren't Jewish, they come in and sit on the periphery and they watch and observe, like they're a little nervous, to say something when there's like apparently highly informed Jewish students who are there. So we actually work in Jewish studies not to call out the Jewishness of our students, so that everybody can understand that they're here to learn the topic. And Professor Johnson, and he gave me permission to share this story too, because I reached out to him for the revised edition of the book. He goes like this to me, and he says, Mark, he said, my Blackness is on every word I teach and every word I publish. And then he said, your whiteness is on every word you teach and publish too, only you don't have to say so. Now, I grew up grew up. I went to grad school at UCLA, and the historian's craft we learned is you don't insert yourself into your narrative. The job of an academic historian is to be third person, detached, analytic, and critical. And as Professor Johnson said to me, your whiteness is all over every page of your book, whether you like it or not, and whether you admit it or not. So in his estimation, you cannot divorce the background, the identity, race, gender, like whichever category we want, from the book, because all of it gets woven in there. So I called my editor, at Brandeis University Press, who gave me the great book title, and I said, I would like to write a preface to the book. I already had an introduction, so I just called it a preface. And in the preface, I'm going to talk about the fact that I'm a white guy writing a book about race, so that anyone reading the book before they get to the first page is going to understand and know what it is, who it is that I am, and then they can judge me however they want from that. So when I was in third grade, my mom brought me to a Harlem Globetrotters basketball game at the Fabulous Forum in Inglewood. If anyone knows LA, it's where the Lakers used to play. And I loved that. I loved it so much. I turned to my mom afterwards. I said, Mom, when I grow up, I'm going to be a Harlem Globetrotter, and then she laughed and said, no, you're not, son. And I said, why not? She said, because you have to be Black to be a Harlem Globetrotter. And at least in my life, that was the first moment I can remember that sort of race mattered in anything. So the first printing of the book came out, and I want to honor Leah Donnella. Leah Donnella was working for the NPR podcast Code Switch, and she was an intern then. Now she's actually one of the editors. And Code Switch is a national podcast which talks about how it is that people of color have one culture sort of in their private space in their home, but then when they go out to sort of white America, they have to what's called code switch. They have to change language, change behaviors in order to better fit in. And Leah reached out and said, as someone who's Black, I code switch to white America. As a woman, I have to code switch to male America. But on my podcast, we never deal with what it's like to be Black, female, and Jewish, having to code switch into Christian America. So she said, would you, can we do an interview, for the podcast? And I was like, of course. And obviously, if it's code switching, like having a white guy on it is not what they're looking for. She ended up doing a blog, and this is, the front page of the blog. What I didn't know about the blog is it got sent out to NPR's entire mailing list, and the book sold out in 6 weeks. And on the one hand, yay, it got sold out in 6 weeks. The other thing I have to say, academic books actually don't have a lot of print runs because no one ever really buys, academic books. So only 500 books were printed. But the flip side is they printed only 500 books because they don't think 500 books would get sold. So yay, it got sold out. And then it went into a second printing. And by the time it went into the second printing, Alana Kaufman, the one I'd mentioned to you, came back onto the scene. Now, Alana's perspective on the book is mixed. Part of it, she was quite upset with me and shared it. But the other part that I was sharing, she said, this is the first time we've seen in an academic book a version of the history that more closely, resonates with Black Jews and with Jews of color in terms of understanding basically the limits of Jewish whiteness and the limits of white Jewish liberalism. So she started book groups. She did in-person book groups in the San Francisco Bay Area. She went to Zoom, and this was even before COVID, to do that. And the second printing sold out just a few months after that. Book went into the third printing, and now, of course, tragically, we had the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police. And this is when the national reckoning on race started. And this is where, American Jews did the Google searches. And I just also want to appreciate Hebrew College, because they were one of the first places to reach out at that time and said, we are committed to focusing our education on this topic. And they brought me in to do some early teaching there. I'll just say in the 15 months of the racial reckoning, I did 130 different Zoom classes on something related to Jews and race. Don Lemon, when he was at CNN, brought me on to his podcast called Silence is Not an Option. And then he brought me on his TV show. This is with the CEO of the NAACP, Mr. Johnson. And a whole lot of attention was being brought to the book and to the themes of the book. I'll just say I'll go back to the podcast. When I was on the podcast, it was the same episode as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the famous former LA Laker. So all my Laker fan friends were like so excited that I, got to be on a podcast with Kareem, and I had to explain we taped it at separate times. I actually didn't meet Kareem. I just ended up on, but after a while I just said, oh, he's such a nice guy and so modest and humble too, after all of that. At the end of the third printing, and we're now going into the fourth printing, my editors called and said, we'd like you to write a new preface. And essentially they said, basically none of us expected that the book would land when it did and how it did. I certainly didn't. I thought I was writing on the white Jewish ethnic revival of the 70s, and now it's in the middle of the racial reckoning. So they gave me a bunch of topics that they wanted me to cover. It's what you call in journalism a puff piece. It's a self-complimentary 2,000 words or so about how it was that the themes of the book resonate with the contemporary racial reckoning for everybody to see. And I submitted it on October the 12th. I was very excited that the next day on October the 13th, they wrote and said, this is great. Of course, they had a list of things they want me to look at because editors always want you to improve it. But they actually asked if it would be okay to co-publish this new preface in something like LA Review of Books or some other, big publication thing so that we can even get more attention. But to my shock and surprise, the next day after that, I got an email telling me that the approval of the new preface had been withdrawn. In fact, they'd already sent the fourth printing to the printers to get printed without the new preface. So it wasn't as if I could, respond and say, hey, why did you do that? I'd like you to reconsider, because the book was already in print. And what began here was a months-long back and forth with the editors at the press about sort of what the objections were and why it was essentially censored in my mind, and then what things we could do about it in the future. Ultimately, I reached out to the editors at the press and I said, I'd like to send this out to the 5 leading scholars in the field of Jews and race. And I'd like to ask for their unbridled critique, because clearly I think it's fine. You don't think it's fine. Let's see what the academic community does. And I sent it out to those 5 who all, they supported it on content, but even more than that, they were like, academics need to have academic freedom. And basically you wrote the book and there's nothing in the new preface different than the book. We don't get this. Eventually, it made it to the pages of the foreword. This was a lead story. And I'll just say that Ari Feldman, who wrote the story, won the award for the most important news story of any Jewish newspaper anywhere in the country for that year for this particular article. So here, I'll just give you a couple quotes as sort of what this dispute is. And now we're getting, now the questions are deep, right? I've given you a bunch of sort of the academic questions about what happens when you're doing causality. But now this is a relationship between doing academic history of the past with the current political realities and how universities, as centers of learning, are going to respond. So one of the editors gave a quote to the journalist that got published in the article that says, we have a long track record at Brandeis of publishing cutting-edge research in a wide range of fields. The only thing we're uncomfortable with is bad scholarship, unquote. So I thought that was pretty intense, right, to argue that the new preface was bad scholarship. It's problematic because prefaces actually aren't scholarly. Those are actually just musings and reflections of the author. So it's not that particular standard. That said, the scholarship apparently was good enough to be published and sold out, I guess, 4 times. But Jonathan Sarna, who is an esteemed and probably one of the most highly regarded American Jewish historians, took a quote. He said that implicating Jews. Oh, I should say the two things that they objected to. I used the phrase white supremacy in the new preface. I said, I think the line was, especially since World War II, American Jews reinforced the system of white supremacy in their lived experience, which is a way of saying that by the 1950s and 60s and beyond, white American Jews, most American Jews were able to benefit from the system of white supremacy, which we're learning about in the racial reckoning. And in fact, while it was not our desire to be a part of a racist system, when we meaning American Jews, moved to the suburbs in the 50s, white Jews were permitted into the suburbs, but families of color were not yet welcomed in there. That reinforces this system. So there was an objection to that word. And the other thing I did in the new preface is I offered an apology to Black Jews for having erased them from my initial book. And I basically, took that lunch I had with Alana, the lessons I learned about Chuck McDew, the understandings I had about how whiteness informs causality with all that. And I said, I missed that and I need to be accountable for missing it. And I was told that I was being too apologetic. So Sarna said that implicating American Jews in white supremacy gave disproportionate weight to the role of racism in American Jewish success. Gina Green, who is a Black Jewish woman from South Carolina, who is an extraordinary social justice leader. In fact, I was just on a panel at Harvard Divinity School at a conference they had on Jews and Black theory, and she was the chair of the panel that I was on. She said for this article, it's almost like white Jews, who often have a tough time claiming their whiteness, are some of the most fragile white people around. And when this article hit, I was not told of this on purpose, but the 5 scholars of Jews and race reached out to 4 more senior scholars in American Jewish history, and they wrote an open letter to Brandeis University Press to express their upset, mostly about the process by which censorship occurred. And certainly, I think they can also get to the content of whether they agree or disagree with my thesis. But to them, the role of universities is not to censor. So that was here. And then let me see. Okay, Brandeis University Press editors wrote a response to the open letter. So you can get both sides. If you wanted to go to that article, you'll be able to read how they saw it as well. Then I got a phone call from the editor of the Journal of Academic Freedom, who had heard about everything that happened, and asked if I were to write this up through the lens of academic freedom and censorship and the nature and purpose of the university. So this is free on their website. If you want to get into now this one's getting like right into the particular details of what professors do. And then a series of op-eds came out. Some op-eds defended my position. This is an op-ed that went against my position. And in fact, the opening line is, have American Jews, quote, reinforced elements of white supremacy in their own lived experience, and then it goes on to there, and she made the argument that I was bringing harm through what I said. So once again, you can, as a true academic, you can go and read things that agreed with my perspective and disagreed with it. That's okay. Then religion. There's a website on religion news about religion, and basically, if you're a newspaper editor and you don't have enough money to have a religion section, you can subscribe to this website, and then every article they publish, you can put in your newspaper. And they heard that I was doing all these talks, mostly to white Jewish audiences. So this is the headline from that, and this is actually a screenshot from the NFL Network talking about anti-Semitism among athletes in the NFL, and we were talking about that. So the whole thing ended up with Brandeis University Press saying, look, it's clear you're unhappy with us. We're going to give you your book back. I want to be clear, I didn't ask for my book back. I asked to talk about the themes that were censored, but they gave me the book back, and NYU Press reached out and asked if they could, if they could publish a revised version of the book, and I was thrilled to be able to do that. Of course, I said, if you want to do the revised version, it has to have the new preface. Yeah, that's what really started all of this. So here's the cover. And I'll say that they picked one of the famous pictures of Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King on the cover with the Torah there. And if you see underneath on the cover, if you see underneath my name, it says "Afterword" by Ilana Kaufman. And that's because I reached out to Ilana and I said, you have been a part of this book and the politics around this book. You have been complimentary of me. You have been critical of me. I really think you're the one to have the last word to sort of talk about how all this lands on really one of our national leaders in the Black Jewish community. You know, would you agree to write the afterword? Initially, I thought it was going to be the preface, but it turned out the afterword was better. And graciously, she agreed. So the book has the new preface in it. It has an afterword by Ilana Kaufman. And then I added a new chapter, which is really the story I'm telling you now, sort of written out in more formal ways. Oh yeah, so I want to say that, so this has Rabbi Heschel on the front cover, and then this is the back cover, and it might be hard to read, it looks a little blurry on my screen, but Professor Susanna Heschel is on the top of the back cover. This is Rabbi Heschel's daughter, who is a scholar at Dartmouth. She's a theologian. And so she wrote a nice book review initially. So I called her up and I said, you know, although like when you publish something, you don't have to ask permission to put it on the back cover, but I figured that I wanted to call her and I said, look, we want to put your dad on the front cover and you on the back cover, you know, like, can we have your blessing for that? And she laughed and said, you know, no, I've never had that one before. So she agreed. And there it is. And then here is the new table of contents. So the preface to the revised edition at the very top, that's the new preface, the one that got censored. And then if you look all the way down to chapter 7, chapter 7 would have been the epilogue of the first book. Chapter 7 is my lunch with Ilana Kaufman, you know, that I had described. And now we have on page 195 a new epilogue to tell this whole story. And then we have the afterword by Ilana Kaufman. So the questions we ask, you know, what do scholars do? I mean, that's like a fundamental question, but I think when we're talking about race and the race of the scholar and all this kind of gets mixed up in the middle of a national reckoning on race, it really forced the question in a profound way. How should scholarship enter the political realm? Should history enter the contemporary period? What meaning do we have from all of this? And for that, I turn it all back to you for your questions. So I'll hand this to Robin or Hava, whoever would like to take it from here.
Thank you very much. Let me just open up the view so we can see everybody. 1 second, Mark.
Sure.
Great. So first of all, I would like to thank Mark for being very open and rather vulnerable, if that's the right word, to discussing the challenges that you faced with the process of sort of the reckoning with this book and the way you responded to it. I think it was an interesting process to hear about the behind the scenes back and forth, and also the discontent within the academic community. So thank you so much for sharing that. A couple of the questions that we did receive, and by the way, feel free to continue to send me questions in the chat or at this stage if you also want to use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and a little yellow hand will come up, and then I will know that you are interested in asking a question. We can do it that way as well. But let me start, Mark, with 2 questions that came in the middle of your talk that were very similar to one another. And they had to do with understanding the concept of Jewish whiteness, white Jewish privilege, in terms of the Shoah and the immigrant roots of many American Jews, to whom our understanding is you are now kind of putting under the umbrella of being white Jews. And there's a little bit of there's some resistance and sort of discomfort with that blanket labeling, a certain presumptuousness, if you will, to that labeling. So I wonder if you could respond to how those Jews who are Ashkenazi descent, so therefore perhaps considered white, fit into the narrative when their roots come from the Shoah and immigration, particularly at a time where the concept of Jews and being white, which I know you talk about, by the way, in your course, you go into a lot of detail about that transition, how we square that.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great question. And I'll say the critique is absolutely right on. And I'll do another pitch for the course because I think the first class we're going to do is going to be the entire time on that very question, which is to say, white Jews have not been white. In Nazi Germany, absolutely white Jews are not white. Nazi ideology had Jews as subhuman. And of course, the end result of that characterization of Jews as non-white was genocide. There is nobody that can argue that Jews are white at Auschwitz, to be just the most blunt about it. And this is what the sociologists call this the social construction of race, which means who gets counted as white and who doesn't get counted as white. While of course it has a lot to do with skin color because that's what we see and that's what sadly we all make our judgments on. For example, the Irish who came to Boston, since we've got Hebrew College here in the 1840s, were considered Black. They were called the Black Irish. They were lower on the social stratum than free Blacks in Boston at that time. Eventually, Irish became white, as it were. So this is why I love being a scholar in Jewish studies. This is why I think this is the topic. By the way, I'm giving you what's called an historiographic rather than an historical overview, meaning I'm not giving you the full history. I'm giving you the latest layer that challenges the earlier ones, which is to say there are times and places where where white Jews have not been white and have suffered genocide. And there are other places and times where white Jews have been considered white and have enjoyed privileges because of it. So I'm very particular to say when I talk about Jews and whiteness, it's post-World War II United States. It's really after 1960, if you want to look at the data on anti-Semitism, which is not to say we don't have continuing anti-Semitism, and we have had the worst anti-Semitism in American Jewish history in the last 6 years or so. But it is to say that anti-Semitism as a sociological force, meaning has it restrained all Jewish people in the United States? It did prior to World War II, 20s and 30s was just awful with the quotas programs and the rest of it. But today, anti-Semitism, as awful as it is not holding the entire group of Jews back in terms of our social progress and our privilege. So this is both and, which is that critique is correct. And it's also true that at other times and places, white Jews have enjoyed racial privilege. And part of what I'm doing mostly in my public speaking, and please come take the course because I think we're going to do 4 weeks on this. We're going to dive deep into it, is we are going to see how I think, and for this, I'll say white Jews are the ones to study if we want to understand race, because we're probably the only group that knows what it's like not to be white and know what it's like to be white in this, not at the same time and place, but certainly in our own minds and our own experience. That's what we can hold. So a lot of what I'm doing is just to say we need to open up and hold multiple narratives from multiple times and places.
Great. All right. I have a couple of questions here that I'm going to bundle together because I think they're related. One question goes back to thinking about since 2020, so since George Floyd, about the way Jewish organizations have made efforts to address racism, both within and outside of their organizations, and where you see those organizations today in terms of having made progress or have they abandoned their efforts. And I would like to add to that the context of a second question, which is about the last 7 months and how all that was started in 2020 and all the good intentions, and our class that we offered here at Hebrew College, for example, examining Jews and race and trying to get to that, to be partners and thought partners. How has that all sort of shown itself to be and emerged in the, since October 7th, and how even recent campus activism fits into some of your historical understandings?
Excellent. I'd just like to welcome everyone to stay with me until next Thanksgiving, so I'll have an opportunity to fully address all of those impossibly challenging questions. So I'll just give as much of an overview as I can. So first, I wanted to send people to Eric Goldstein's book, The Price of Whiteness. It's an older book, but it really is sort of the classic academic treatment of Jews and whiteness. Eric Goldstein, The Price of Whiteness, and what he does in this book is he takes a little over 100 years of history and sort of shows when white American Jews are white, aren't white, how it goes back and forth and what that means. Karen Brodkin has a very famous book. She's an anthropologist, called How Jews Became White Folks and what that says about race in America, if people are interested in another source on that. In terms of what's happening in the racial reckoning, I send everyone to the Jews of Color Initiative, or to Bechol Lashon, which I think their website is ineverytongue.org. These are two of the leading organizations on Jews of Color Initiative and In Every Tongue, Bechol Lashon. They do have resource tabs on their websites. The Jews of Color Initiative has been funding scholarly demographic surveys and things like that, where they're asking lots of Jews of color lots of questions around what their experiences are in organized Jewish spaces. In terms of the racial reckoning, this is purely anecdotal, but I will tell you in 15 months, when I did 130 talks, the busiest day I was doing 5 talks in one day, and then it ended. Like it started in May, and then by the middle of the next summer, it was done. We had issues with anti-Semitism, and to put it another way, I got calls from dozens of rabbis after the racial reckoning because they wanted to do their high holiday sermons on racism, and they wanted to chat. The next high holiday cycle, they'd all switch to their high holiday sermons, sadly, on anti-Semitism, which was spiking again. One thing I also know as a white man is in terms of the contemporary reality for people of color and for Jews of color, I need to listen and learn rather than tell you what I think from my own perspective. And the sense that I'm getting, and actually Lana Kaufman just published last week in E-Jewish Philanthropy an article on this very topic. Basically, which is there has been, I think an abandonment by Jewish organizations of their commitment to racial justice work. And Alana was calling for folks not to run away from DEI, that it's needed now more than ever. But E-Jewish Philanthropy, look up Alana Kaufman and you can see it there. All right, last 7 months, oh my gosh. All right, so I published in J Weekly on the 6-month anniversary on this. So if you go to J Weekly and type in my name, you can see that. I just finished a piece for Reconstructing Judaism that addresses this. It's not out yet, but it hopefully will come out soon. And my argument in both of those pieces is what we've had since October 7th is less anything new, although I have to say, 21 years at SF State, I've never seen anything like this. Like, I have to tell you, this is historic on a 50-year horizon, probably 75-year horizon. So I don't want to underestimate when I say this is a lot of stuff that happened in the mid and late 60s playing out for a new generation, which is that the hard left in the US was anti-Zionist and some of the time anti-Semitic, that there's a depiction of Israel that used to be a socialist utopia from 48 till, I don't know, we could say 67 maybe, like leftists in the US loved Israel because it was trying to do socialism on a national scale, and not too many places got to do it. And the kibbutz movement, like, they were really excited. One thing I write about, an Academy Award-winning documentary called Berkeley in the 60s. There is a scene of a free speech movement protest in Sproul Hall at UC Berkeley in 1964, and they're all sitting down in the administration building, and someone brought in like a turntable, and they started playing Israeli folk dance music, and half the people in the protest stand up and start Israeli folk dancing in the protest. And I say to my current SF State students, could you imagine Israeli folk dance music at one of these encampments and half of the leftist protesters standing up and dancing? That to me is the most profound difference between what was going on in the 60s and what's going on now, which is that Israel went from the idealistic socialist utopia to the personification of racism and white supremacy in America, where now the Israeli military becomes the Southern sheriffs with the water cannons. Palestinians become the new Black Southerners, and the parallel gets reinforced there. And this is something called intersectionality, which is actually a theory created by Kimberly Crenshaw about Black women in particular. It's a theoretical idea. It has been politicized and then applied to this. And I noticed in there was a chat question about the fact that a majority of Israelis are Jews of color. All right, now this is a great question because technically they are, meaning if you put Israeli Jews on the standard of racialization of the United States, they would be Jews of color. But I go to Israel and I talk to Israelis who would qualify as a Jew of color and say, what is it like to be a Jew of color in Israel? And they just stare at me because they have no idea what I'm talking about. Because race is socially constructed. That means race plays out differently in Israel than it plays out in the US. So for me to get on a plane and sort of land there and impose a US-based understanding on an Israeli society is just too much. So, all right, that was my quick answer to a really complicated question.